Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series. I'm your host, Laura Stack, the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors Youth Marijuana Prevention, a nonprofit in Denver, Colorado. And we are so thrilled. I am so thrilled to welcome this guest to our show. Sir Robin Murray is a delight. I have had the pleasure of getting to know him over the past several years. He was the first person that I reached out to, not understanding that he was one of the world's foremost researchers in cannabis, to ask him some questions about Johnny's death and his psychosis. And he kindly responded to me in email, and we since then have created a great friendship. And he is now on Johnny's Ambassadors Scientific Advisory Board, as well as his wife, dear wife, Marta DeForti. And he almost needs no introduction, but I will introduce him in just a moment. He's going to talk for a bit, and then we're going to take your questions. So we are going to record this so that you can pass this along to other people when he is done. So in the question box in your system tray, if you would please type into the question box where you live so that we can practice doing the question box. That way I can make sure when you have a question that you're able to type in. Okay, Robin, we have people from Northern California, Portland, Oregon, Huntsville, Alabama, El Paso, Texas, North Carolina, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Montana. So you are literally getting representatives from all over the United States, Robin. So, okay, great. You all found the question box. So as Robin says something that you want to ask a question about, type it into the box. Don't wait until the end. And then I'm going to come back on and read him all the questions in the order that they were received. Sir Robin Murray is a professor of psychiatric research at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London, and he is a fellow of the Royal Society and FRS. He is considered one of the world's foremost cannabis researchers. Robin, thank you so much for doing this for us. Welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors.
So thank you very much, Laura, and hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. Of course, I feel a bit odd talking about cannabis legalization because cannabis is not legal in the UK, whereas in many or maybe most of your states, it is legal. So as Laura says, I'm really an expert on psychosis. I don't know about road traffic accidents and cannabis or respiratory disease and cannabis, but my expertise is in psychosis. And gradually through the 1990s and early 2000s, we saw more and more people who came to us with psychosis, hallucinating, having bizarre ideas, deluded, and their families would say to us, do you think it could be anything to do with the cannabis? And we would say, no, I don't think cannabis is a safe drug. But after this happened so much that we realized we should pay attention to the families and start researching. And so it's really for 20 years we'd been researching cannabis and psychosis. But as I say, I hope to learn as much, if not more, from you than you from me because of your experience of legalization.
Robin, you might need to click on your screen. There you go.
Yeah. So just unlike the US, cannabis consumption in the UK has not significantly changed since about 1996. It increased up to about 1996 and then fell a little bit and has risen again, but the consumption has been fairly stable. This is very unusual because most countries it has significantly increased. And this slide is actually showing the potency of cannabis up till 2008. And you can see that from 1995 till 2008, what we call cannabis resin in the black at the bottom, or sometimes called soap bar, a hard substance, stayed about the same. Imported herbal cannabis, that would be what we would call marijuana, became more potent, and what we call skunk or sinsemilla became more potent. And you'll wonder, why am I just showing up to 2008? Because every time there was a government, these are government figures, every time there was a government report, got into the newspapers, caused a lot of fuss, and the politicians were asked all sorts of difficult questions like, have you ever smoked cannabis? Should cannabis be prohibited more severely, or should it be legalized? So this was a headache for the politicians. So they decided very sensibly from their point of view not to fund any more studies of the potency of cannabis. So we had to do it ourselves. So, and this is showing, we did a survey in 2017 of cannabis confiscated by the police. So this is a suitcase actually that my wife Martha carried through the London Underground, full of sinsemilla or skunk. And so although cannabis consumption has not got more common, the consumption is now almost entirely of what we would call more potent cannabis. I know that many of you Americans will laugh, but we call potent cannabis about 15% THC. And you can see here am I looking quite cheap. For some reason, my hang on one minute while I change my slideshow to stop it changing by itself. Set up slides, record, nearest customers present play. Why is it doing that? Oh, use timings, get that off. Sorry, I hope you can still see my slides. And
Everything looks great.
You can see them okay, Laura?
Yep, everything looks great.
Okay, so this is a sort of example of the sort of cannabis that's sold in the streets in the UK. And this sinsemilla, we used to have this resin or cannabis hashish really, which was not potent at all, and now it's got much more potent. So there's a lot of evidence, and I'll just basically summarize it. There have been three big summaries of the world literature, meta-analyses they're called, and they all three pointed to cannabis use being a risk factor for psychosis, for hallucinations and delusions, bizarre behavior. This work is actually done mostly by this guy who's in the Mediterranean here, or whose name is Vangelis Vassos. And this figure along the bottom, each of these lines is a different study, and along the bottom is how much people have how much cannabis they've taken in each of the studies. Along the bottom, the left-hand side is the lowest 20%, and at the other end is the top 20%, 0.8 to 1. That's the top 20%. And if you look along the bottom, you'll see that in each of these slides, each of these studies, the people who'd taken more cannabis were more likely to be psychotic. But along the bottom, this gray one, that is a study by Tien in the US in 1990, when your cannabis was not very strong. But it's got steadily stronger. This red one is a study of South London, when cannabis was about our 15%. And you can see that the risk of being psychotic is increased 7 times. So if you're smoking this, what we call skunk sinsemilla cannabis, you're 7 times more likely to be psychotic than the general population. So there isn't any real argument now that heavy cannabis use does increase your risk of psychosis. It doesn't, just like cigarette smoking increases your risk of heart attacks or lung cancer, but you still meet people of age 90 who've smoked 40 cigarettes a day and don't have lung cancer. So it's not a certainty, it just increases the risk. So if you're smoking our skunk, as I say, you're about 7 to 8 times more likely. Now, to become psychotic. But say 1% of the population becomes psychotic, instead of 1%, it would be a 7 or 8%. Still means that lots and lots of heavy cannabis smokers are not psychotic. Just like lots and lots of heavy drinkers amazingly don't run into trouble with their livers. So then, if we assume for now that cannabis does contribute to psychosis and does induce psychosis, just like cocaine or amphetamine can also provoke psychosis. What I wanted now just to show some evidences, not to do with legalization, but to do with the frequency of cannabis use in different countries and what happens to the frequency of psychosis. So this is a big study that we did across Europe and 5 different countries. And in each country, we looked at several different cities. For example, in UK, we looked at London, a big city, and Cambridge, a little city. In France, we looked at Paris, a big city, and a little village place called Clermont-Ferrand. We looked at Amsterdam in Holland and a more rural area, and so on. And so some places, you know, if you're planning your holidays and you're thinking, oh, I'd like to go to Europe, but it would be nice to go to somewhere where I don't meet a lot of people who are psychotic. Maybe some of you work with people who are psychologically disturbed. Maybe you say, well, it would be a bit of a busman's holiday. It would be it would be nice to do something different and not meet the people that I'm treating every day. So if that was the case, you don't want to come to London or Amsterdam, because these are the places with the most psychosis. 61 people for every 100,000 go psychotic in London every year. In Amsterdam, it's 47 per 100,000 go psychotic every year. Whereas in Southern Europe, it's much less. So my wife, for example, is from Palermo in Sicily. Only 11 people per 100,000 go psychotic there. Now, maybe the people, the doctors in Palermo miss some cases of psychosis, but they don't miss 5 out of 6. But my wife, she always says that she is born in Palermo and now works in London. That she did a silly thing by coming to London. She's now 5 times more likely to go psychotic than she was in Palermo. But this is related to the consumption of cannabis, and particularly high potency, what we call high potency cannabis. In Palermo, they have cannabis like the kind of, well, when I say cannabis, you would mean marijuana, but like the kind of marijuana you had in the 1960s and 70s. In Palermo, they were still smoking that very weak stuff, whereas in Paris and Amsterdam and London, much higher frequency of use and much more potent cannabis. So this is my wife Marta, and this is her study, and this is relating the frequency of cannabis use to the rate of psychosis. So the frequency of cannabis use is in black, and the frequency of people being referred to see psychiatrists for psychosis is in the grey. And you can see that again, the incidence is highest in London, Amsterdam, and Paris, and you can see that the cannabis use pretty well parallels the incidence of psychosis, except in Madrid. And you'll see that in Madrid, the psychosis is not so common, but cannabis use is quite widely used. But in Spain at this time, they used very weak cannabis. So there is a relationship in this study between cannabis use and the frequency of psychosis. But you'll all know the phrase, there's statistics, damn statistics and lies, that you can, sometimes statistics can be manipulated. You might think, well, this is just one study. Is there any other evidence? Well, we've done a study across and this is a picture of Craig Morgan, who led the study, across India, Nigeria, and Trinidad. And this is a place called Kanchipuram, which is near Chennai. So again, it's a rural area. And then Ibadan in Nigeria. And you can see that these rates of psychosis are quite low. They're like the rates in Southern Europe. They're not like the rates in London or Amsterdam. But here is Trinidad, where the rates are like very similar to the rates in the UK, 59 per 100,000. So several times higher than in rural India or Ibadan in Nigeria. And you'll not be surprised that we think that's related to the frequency of cannabis use. So again, this is in the black is the frequency of psychosis, much more common in Trinidad. In Trinidad, the people can either be African Trinidadians or Indian Trinidadians. And it's particularly the people from Africa. If you talk to people in Trinidad, they say when African Trinidadians are stressed, they smoke cannabis. When Indian Trinidadians are stressed, they drink alcohol. You can see that the frequency of cannabis use in rural India, in Nigeria, was low, but in Trinidad it was high, especially in men and especially in people of African origin. So both these studies are showing that if you take a country, you can to some extent predict how common psychosis is once you know how common use of cannabis is and the potency of the cannabis used. Potency in Trinidad is about on average 25% THC. And they've just legalized cannabis, actually, because I guess it was so out of control. They thought they might get more control over it if it was legalized, but we've no idea the outcome of this yet. So this is looking at different countries. What about countries with different patterns of cannabis use? Everybody knows that cannabis use in many countries has become much commoner, and the potency has become commoner too. So what happens there? So this is Denmark, and this is the frequency. The incidence really just means frequency of schizophrenia since 1972, and you can see that initially it seemed to get less. Then from the 1980s, it climbed up, and then especially from the 2000s, it climbed up further. And during this period in Denmark, both the consumption of cannabis and its potency has increased. And this is a study where they calculated the proportion of schizophrenia that was attributable to cannabis. And you can see down here, it was quite low. Only 2% of all people with schizophrenia, they thought it was resulting from cannabis use disorder, but it steadily increased. And by 2016, about 8% of people with psychosis, they thought it was due to cannabis. We've done a study in South London, and particularly Jane Boydell and Diego Quattroni. And in the blue is the frequency of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is just a severe variant of psychosis. And you can see way back in the 1960s, it was running around 11 or 15 per 100,000. So before I was talking about psychosis, and the rates in London were about 60 per 100,000. Now I'm just talking about the severe type schizophrenia. In the 60s, it was running about 11, 14%, but they gradually crept up to about 21% by 1990. By 2010, it was up to a 35 per 100,000. So it's trebled since the 1960s. So psychosis and schizophrenia is 3 times more common in London than it was in the 60s. So I always tell our young psychiatrists they have to work a lot harder because there's far more psychotic patients than there were when I was a young psychiatrist. And you can see that this is the proportion of the patients with psychosis who were noted to be heavy smokers of cannabis. And you can see it was hardly any in the 60s, and it's now up to well, 10 years ago, it was up to half, and we're just redoing the data, and it looks as if it's at least as high now. So both in Denmark and in South London, schizophrenia has become more common, and the proportion of schizophrenia attributable to cannabis use has got worse, has increased. Now, the only country which has actually formally decriminalized cannabis in Europe is Luxembourg has just decriminalized, has just legalized it actually, but in 2001 they decriminalized cannabis in Portugal. So in Portugal, if you're found smoking cannabis, you're given a warning. If you're found 3 times, you're sent off to see a psychologist who's supposed to try and persuade you to stop taking cannabis. And this is what has happened since cannabis was decriminalized. Oops. So if you look, so it was decriminalized in 2000, which just meant you didn't get sent to jail any longer if you're possessing cannabis. You can see that 0.87% of all people with schizophrenia were noted to be cannabis users, so less than 1%. If you look down to 2015, you'll see that, that 10% of people with psychosis, it was thought to be due to cannabis. So decriminalization has been accompanied by an increase in cannabis consumption and, of course, an increase in potency, because that was happening anyway, and a higher proportion of schizophrenia being due to cannabis. Well, what about coming nearer to you, to North America? So this is the best place to study the effect of cannabis on psychosis and psychiatric disorder is Canada, undoubtedly. The Canadians are the biggest consumers of cannabis in the world, bigger than you Americans actually, and bigger than the Australians. And this looks at cannabis consumption since 2001 up to 2019, and the blue is cannabis use. Cannabis was legalized for medicinal use in 2001, and it was then legalized for recreational use in 2018. But you can see that over the 2000s, cannabis use gradually increased, particularly more recently, and it started off as 10% of the population were using cannabis, and then it's up to 25% by 2019. And you can see that in red is daily cannabis use, and although it's not so common, obviously, it also increased, particularly in the later years. And cannabis use problems, that was it's a rating of cannabis dependence. You can see in grey, it also increased. Now, cannabis was legalized in 2018, and it looks as if there was a further increase thereafter, but it was increasing before then. And the interesting thing is that the increase tended to follow the Canadian government's announcement that it was intending to legalize cannabis. So the Trudeau's party announced way back in 2015 that if they won the election, 2014, if they won the election, that they would then legalize cannabis. So in 2016, they actually put a law into Parliament that it would start in 2018. And you can see that once people realized the government was in favor of legalization, that cannabis consumption actually increased. So this is visits to the emergency departments in Ontario Ontario in Canada. Along the bottom are young people up to, I think, up to 18 and above are adults. And you can see that this is from 2010 now. You can see again that it increased steadily. In 2018, it was legalized, and you can see that it seemed to stop increasing. And one reason for that is that in Ontario, when cannabis legalized, it was very chaotic, and the various shops started opening, but they couldn't get the cannabis, and therefore cannabis, it was actually more difficult to get cannabis in the first year after legalization than it had been previously. And then there's the next year, which when the various from 2020, by this time the various shops and so on had got their act together, and stores had opened, and cannabis use was higher, and you can see that by then more people were coming to emergency departments. Although it seemed more sort of stable than actually increasing. So we did a study. I'm sure you've met professors before. When professors like me say we did a study, we really mean somebody else did a study, and we get some of the credit for it. And this is done by a man called Russ Callahan, who works in Canada. And he looked at presentations for cannabis-induced psychosis and schizophrenia in Ontario and Alberta in Canadian provinces. And here you can see this is the number of visits for cannabis-induced psychosis. The line down here is when cannabis was legalized. But what you can see again is that from 2015, each of these things is a month, which is why it sort of jags up and down. These are visits to emergency departments, and you can see that there was a steady, there was a bit of an increase. But again, it was once the Canadian government had announced its intention to legalize cannabis that visits to the emergency clinic started taking off, presumably because consumption had started taking off. Then again, because of the chaos of actually trying to get cannabis immediately after legalization, when the police were actually tougher on illegal use, it if anything cooled off a little bit. So a familiar picture for you all, and you know the blue is where cannabis is fully legalized. The green is where cannabis is legal for medicinal reasons, and the grey is where it isn't yet legal for either, although this may be out of date and some states may have moved since then. So you know that in places like, I don't know about Colorado, but in California, there's quite a lot of advertising, and you can get your marijuana delivered at home. You hear it, people advertising, if you're smoking every day, our cannabis is very good to smoke every day. Now, there have been various studies across different states, and particularly by a lady called Debbie Hassan. She's the great expert in frequency of drug use across the US, and she shows that cannabis use has increased. People used to say, well, if we legalize cannabis, maybe everybody will go back to preferring the old-fashioned low potency types. And the exact opposite has happened. Everywhere cannabis use has been legalized, the potency has increased, and cannabis use disorder, they've all increased in adults in states which have legalized cannabis. There's some contention about what's happened to younger people. And I think this is really what's happened everywhere across the world where they have legalized or partially legalized cannabis, with one exception, and that is Uruguay. So Uruguay legalized cannabis about the same time as Colorado, but they did it in a very sort of Stalinist way, where you need to get ration books. You can apply to get a ration of cannabis every month, and you have to go to particular government shops. So it's quite a hassle to get the cannabis. So they have done this, and their consumption doesn't seem to have increased. So one little study, there's not much data from the US, but one little study divide up the US into the green states where cannabis had been legalized for a while, the blue states where it was legalized for medicinal, and the ones where it hadn't been legalized at all. I think this was done in 2017, so there were more states which hadn't legalized. But they then looked at how liberal was the getting cannabis. So they had a score for the green countries versus the blue countries versus the gray, not countries, states, and they rated each state in terms of how easy it was to get cannabis legally, and they showed that the easier it was to get cannabis, the greater the proportion of psychosis was attributed to cannabis. So a bit similar to what had happened in other places that cannabis became more available. So this is for the effects of legalization. Well, you know that I'm sure this is a familiar slide to you, that this is in Colorado. You've got far more marijuana dispensaries than Starbucks or McDonald's. Similarly, in Oregon, more dispensaries than Starbucks and McDonald's. In Washington, where Starbucks come from, you can see that Starbucks is holding out, and they still have more Starbucks than dispensaries or McDonald's. You all know that in states like Colorado, potency has greatly increased. So when I say to colleagues, psychiatrist colleagues or addiction colleagues from Colorado or California, and I say we talk about high potency as 15 or 20% THC, they laugh and say if only our people were smoking that instead of taking crumble or shatter or honeycomb or other types of cannabis whose potency can go up to 95%. So it's maybe a bit like in the days for alcohol. It used to be that a couple of thousand years ago you can only get watery beer, but gradually down the years they found how you could get more potent wine, and then they found that they could distill alcohol. So you know, instead of getting sort of 2 or 3% beer, or sorry, beer with 2 or 3% alcohol, you can now get you can get whiskey or vodka with 50 or 60% alcohol in it, and it's a bit similar to cannabis, and THC is a bit similar. You know that there are more people ending up in emergency departments from particularly edible cannabis, overdose with edible cannabis. I like to tell the story that once I was giving a lecture in Canada to about 100 psychiatrists, and there was a very nice man who was the chairman, who was about in his maybe early 40s, and he was just an orthodox chairman. But the end of my lecture on cannabis and psychosis, he privately said to me, I didn't like to say this publicly, but I once went psychotic on cannabis. And I had a very extroverted girlfriend at the time who was a great baker. So she baked me this great cake for my birthday. So I had a couple of pieces, and it was a really good cake. So I had a third piece. And by this time she was saying, I think you've had enough. And he said, then no, I thought it was a really good cake. So I had a fourth piece. And he said, I felt fine until an hour and a half later. Things started becoming very bizarre, and I started to hear things, and I started to get have very funny beliefs and experiences. And she's at this point she said that she had put cannabis in the cake. So they went off to. She was a nurse, and they said we went off. She insisted I went to the emergency clinic, and so that I could get an antipsychotic. But on the way to the emergency clinic, I remembered he said that in Canada at that time, if you were a doctor and you were found to have taken drugs, you lost your license. So he said, we decided not to go to the emergency clinic in Canada, but we were just north of the border. So we went down and crossed the border into Buffalo. And there I went to the emergency clinic and I got my antipsychotic. And he, of course, he was fine ever after. He not had any further problems. And you also know that places like Colorado, the proportion of road traffic accidents involving cannabinoids has also increased. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm very happy to answer any questions, and I'm very eager to learn from you your experiences. Essentially, we are in the UK holding out against the general trend towards, we have a rather reactionary government at present, and sometimes having reactionary governments, it's not all bad. So our government, our current lady in charge of drug addiction and things like that, she wants to increase the illegality. She wants to make cannabis more illegal rather than more legal, which is the direction everybody else is going.
Well,
Okay, I'll stop then,
it's
Laura.
going the opposite direction here, of course. We say in Colorado, there's no putting the horse back in the barn. As much as we would love to see marijuana repealed, it's in our Constitution. That would be very difficult to do. And in polling adults, that wouldn't happen here. So we are faced with the situation of, given the ongoing march in legalization in the US, how do we protect people, our youth particularly? We do have a few questions. So would love to, anyone, if you have a question on anything Robin has presented or something that you're curious about that was not presented, please type that into the chat. Okay, Robin, this is from Dr. Christine Miller. Hi, Christine. In the US, we have a problem with silencing of public health experts by anti-lobbying laws. We see this all the time, which limit the ability of university faculty from speaking to legislators and the public about topics which have any political or as well as public health relevance. Would you describe what limitations you have in the UK in terms of faculty speaking out on topics like cannabis-induced psychosis, which has a bearing on how legislators there develop laws? What is your experience?
So we don't have any restrictions on that. It used to be, I started talking about this 20 years ago, and for the first 10 years, I used to get invited to do debates, and the debate title would be called "Does Cannabis Cause Psychosis?" And I would say yes, and there would be a vote, and then there would be a debate, and I would lose heavily. But gradually, I did very better. And the last 10 years, there haven't been any debates because they can't find anybody to have the other side to say that cannabis doesn't cause psychosis. So British and European psychiatrists and psychologists and addiction specialists have been quite vocal in discussing that. We don't have any limits. But what I don't understand, if this is the case, why is cigarette smoking going? Surely public health people have been saying that smoking tobacco is a bad thing, but how is that different from saying that smoking cannabis can risk your health?
Well, it's crazy because some states, like the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, do require for every purchase of a dispensary product to insert a flyer into the bag when it is bought. And it says right on the top warning, use of marijuana concentrate may lead to psychotic disorders and symptoms, including delusions, hallucinations. So some states are bound by their laws to report. They know that marijuana causes psychosis in many states also, but other states, there isn't any such requirement. And of course, the marijuana industry here, their whole game is doubt. So for every study you cite, they'll cite something else that, of course, was sponsored by the marijuana industry and skews the data, in terms of the way that.
Well, that's very interesting, Laura. An interesting thing happened in Canada when Canada legalized cannabis. They had warnings: don't smoke cannabis during pregnancy, don't smoke cannabis if you are using heavy machinery, and cannabis can induce psychosis. After a year, the psychosis bit was taken out after lobbying
Yes,
from
that's
the
right.
industry. So it doesn't say that any longer. So we don't have as yet a cannabis industry, but we're getting the sort of waves from the US. For example, one of our members of parliament was given $400,000 to campaign for medicinal legalization. We do actually have medicinal legalization, but it's very unpopular. The British doctors don't like to prescribe it. So although it's been legal for 4 years, less than 1,000 people can get medicinal cannabis in a year.
Interesting. Well, and here, tobacco and alcohol, that's all regulated by our federal government, but they have not stepped in, of course, as of yet. And so rather than the FDA coming in and putting regulations in place and checking or having limits on potency, they have just so far been silent and left that to the states.
Well, isn't this why you're called the Wild West?
It is the wild, wild west out here, except it's not just the west, it's the north, south, east, west, it's everywhere. Okay, do you know if there is a similar study or information in the US about first episode psychosis, very similar to how there is in the UK? I think you showed us that there are very limited studies like that.
There are little studies,
Yeah.
but it's very difficult to do epidemiological study in places like the UK or Italy or particularly Scandinavia. There is a socialized system, which means that the government runs the hospitals, and the government or the hospitals feed all their data back to a central register.
Records. Yeah.
And therefore you can count how many people are coming with their first episode of psychosis. In the US, you have all these different hospitals sort of competing, as I understand it, and therefore they all have different record systems, and so there are the beginnings of some such studies, but it's difficult to you can get studies of the proportion of people coming to such and such university hospital with their first psychosis who are known to be using cannabis, but they're not sort of representative of like New York or the whole of Denver or something like that.
There was an interesting study, I think it was January of 22, so it's been over a year. Our Harvard Medical School researchers pulled census data. So this was one way they tried to get around it. And they rated what they call the marijuana friendliness of all of the 50 states, right? If you had none, it was a 1. If you had medical, it was a 2. If you had recreational and medical, it was a 3. And they were able to show a correlation in the incidence of hospitalizations associated with psychosis from cannabis use. So there's another very limited study, but your point is well taken that until we have a mechanism by which we can get our arms around all of the data rather than all these little individual pieces like coming out of the UC Health. like you showed. That's a very
Yeah,
powerful.
the other way that people do it is that I mean, it's not that we used to think that psychosis is quite different. That, you know, you think of depression, we've all been depressed, and therefore we know what severe depression is just going to be like, worse than what you or I had. Uh, so we know it's a continuum. We used to think that's not the case for psychosis, but we now do. We think that you can be just a very little paranoid, you could be moderate paranoid, you could be, and then
Yeah,
you could be psychotic. So you can actually study the general population and see in the general population, is cannabis use associated with having more psychotic symptoms? Even people walking about the streets, so they're increasingly doing that. So we can see these kind of studies from the US.
that's true, because there are some kind of premortal states where they're thinking, you know, people are watching me or people are after me, and maybe they haven't fully gone psychotic, but they're certainly suspicious and a little paranoid. And so that's interesting. There are degrees
I
of
think
that. Yes.
it's like they say, you know, sometimes they say that the biggest problems for society from alcohol don't come from alcoholics. They come from people crashing their car when they're drunk, or bashing their wives when they're drunk, or people who may just drink now and again. And I think cannabis is like that too. The other thing we haven't talked about is I think there's now quite good evidence that cannabis is associated with increased violence. That,
Yes.
which is funny because we tend to, you know, we think cannabis of hippies and make love and not war sort of thing. But there are now good studies showing that the heavier you smoke cannabis, the more likely you are to get into disputes. Or I think perhaps because people get a bit paranoid and they think other people are against them, I better get them before they get me.
Well, we see that here in the US, you know, with shootings, young people, usually young males, shooting up schools or theaters, you know, and when you dig in to their history and you hear some of their friends and family talk, oh, whoops, turns out they were a heavy marijuana user. So we see that
Yeah,
here as well. Are there studies on that in Europe as well on violence?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, I'll have to get
Though,
some of that.
though, though, luckily, we don't have the same rates of shooting as you do.
Probably because you don't have 80, 90% shatter and wax and dabs too.
No, no, because we don't have so much guns.
And guns, where you have to have both. Or maybe you're
Yeah.
just nicer. Maybe you're just nicer.
No, 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 certainly not.
Everybody's as nice as you, right? Let's see, Robin, do you think we are going to hold out in the UK or follow the US? This is from Terry Hammond in the UK.
I don't know. I've actually been surprised that there's been relatively little campaigning for legalizing. I suppose so many different things happened, you know, COVID, and well, we had Brexit and then COVID and then the
Right.
Ukraine war, and all of these things have sort of overwhelmed other sort of campaigns. So it's not a huge issue at present, but other European countries are. Germany has officially decided that they're going to legalize, but they haven't decided how they're going to do it. Switzerland has a pilot in a study in Zurich area. Interestingly, Holland is going slightly the other way because Holland has been the place where you could buy cannabis in coffee shops, legally sort of allowed, but they've been greatly shutting down their coffee shops. And indeed, anybody who's visited Amsterdam will know that the center of Amsterdam is full of cannabis and naked ladies in the windows, and they're trying to abolish this
Yeah.
to get rid of sort of cannabis tourism.
Yeah, we were
So
reading about that.
but I think we usually get your bad habits after a few years.
Darn it. Ah, I hope not. It's going in the right direction now. Let's see, Robin, is there a difference between visual and auditory hallucinations? Could you please describe those? I've heard marijuana causes both, but where drugs classified as hallucinogens only cause visual hallucinations, is that true? Are there any implications? What do you see with
Well,
marijuana?
it's generally true. It's not invariable. So you can hear voices with hallucinogens, with things like LSD, and excuse me, you certainly hear you see things with LSD, and you hear
Like
things
pink
with,
elephants with LSD.
yes, with cannabis or with psychosis, regular psychosis, it's much more common to hear things, and you can see it as a sort of exaggeration of anxiety. You know, you go into a party and you go in through you open the door, you go into the party. Just at that point, everybody bursts out laughing. And you think, my God, are they laughing at me? Have I got the wrong dress on, or is my zip undone? And then after a minute, you realize that somebody's telling a joke. But people can be increasingly sensitive to the views of other people, and then you can begin and worry: are they looking at me? Are they watching me? And then after a little while, you begin to think: are they talking about me? And then you hear them talking. So you can see that hearing things is in some way more physiological than seeing hallucinations is relatively uncommon.
Okay.
But there's a further point, is that things like LSD make you see things. Cannabis makes you suspicious mostly. So it's much more common to be paranoid than actually you may begin to hear things, but the predominance is a of suspicion. I'll give you an example. We give THC to young adults experimentally to see if we can induce the psychosis, and then can we stop, you know, transient psychosis for about 30 minutes, 30 to 60 minutes, and then we try and block the effects with different medications, including CBD. And we had one lady of about 22 who came, and we gave her the THC, and she looked very strange. She certainly looked psychotic. She looked frightened, and her eyes were darting around. But whenever we asked her, how are you getting on? She says, oh, I'm perfect. I'm fine. Do you feel, can you hear anything? No, 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 I'm fine. I feel totally relaxed. She didn't look like relaxed at all. Uh, the next day, so we scored her, you know, that she didn't have any psychotic symptoms. She's told us. The next day she emailed us and said, I'm very sorry, I hope I haven't ruined your experiment. I was convinced you were going to try and kill me, and
Wow.
therefore I didn't want to tell you anything. I just wanted to get out of that
Oh
room
my
as
gosh.
fast as possible. And of course, people who work in mental health services are familiar with this, that
Yes.
sometimes people who are very paranoid will tell you all about it, but sometimes they won't, because they think you're part of the conspiracy against them.
That is something we hear all the time, just in slightly different versions. You know, the mob's after me, the FBI is tracking me, or my phone is watching me, or that's a really good differentiation between the hallucinations and the suspicion. Thank you for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Okay, have you looked at the relationship of suicide, of both attempts and completed, to cannabis use?
Well, we've not looked at that, but there is a lady called Gobi. I'm not sure how to pronounce
Yeah,
it. She's an
coffee. Mhm.
Italian lady who works in Montreal, and she has done a big review of the world literature, and certainly said it shows an association between cannabis use and suicide and thoughts of suicide in young people. She
Okay.
just did
Yeah.
it, I think she just did it in people up to about 20. So there also have been some other smaller studies. So I have a suspicion that there is there, 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 that there is such an effect. Well, there's also been this question: is it an effect on depression? And I think there is a modest. I don't know that it's. Well, it's more difficult to measure depression because it's so all-pervasive than it is to measure psychosis. So I think there probably is an effect, but the data are not as say. There's not so much data as there is for psychosis, but clinically one certainly comes across people. For anxiety, it's sort of paradoxical because there is the fact that the CBD, which is in some forms of cannabis, can actually can diminish anxiety. So when sometimes you get people who smoke cannabis and they get an immediate reduction of anxiety, and then about 2 hours later they get paranoia coming through. And well, it's in some ways a bit like drinking at night and getting the hangover or the next day. But the research into anxiety, depression, and suicide is not. There isn't been as much research as there's been in psychosis. We need to do more.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you. Okay, in Massachusetts, marijuana is legal, but there is legislation to allow social consumption cafes, and other counties and states allow such cafes. What can we do in marijuana to prevent them? So this would be, do you recommend that states, continue to put up legislation to try to prevent things, overturn laws, allow vending machines, online purchases, consuming in public?
I'm not an expert, and I think you'll know much more about what is effective. I think people often say in the UK, well, why is it legal to drink alcohol or to smoke cigarettes or to be addicted to sugar and die of obesity?
Yeah, we hear that.
Because they're all legal. But of course, far more people die because they are legal. I mean, if
it's not a good indicator.
Yeah, so my assumption is that the more available a substance is, the more people. I think we humans we like immediate gratification, and you can see this with obesity, that we enjoy eating, and the more available it is, the more we get, the more difficult it is not to become obese. I think I mean, it's my suspicion is that politicians are such a pushover for money and industry
Yeah.
that it's that it ought to be possible to legalize cannabis with such restrictions that consumption doesn't go sky high and potency doesn't go sky high, but nobody apart from people in Uruguay have done it, and it was never very commonly used in Uruguay. So my view is
study. I'm gonna look at that.
I think education has to be the answer.
Yeah.
That education that did in the tobacco industry, and the cannabis industry just takes a leaf out of the tobacco industry's book and will do its best to deny, just like it took 40 years before the tobacco industry stopped claiming that that smoking didn't cause lung cancer.
Yeah. And by then we'll lose many generations of young people, unfortunately.
Well, not just young people.
Yeah, and it's no guarantee that it's harmless for anybody.
No.
What about research on the recovery rate? What are you seeing in your clinics of people who do develop psychosis? Are there any advances in treatment? We don't have Sativex here. What is done for people who do develop this? Besides becoming sober.
Yeah. So basically in the UK, with the exception of our own hospital, there are no specialized services for cannabis, people with cannabis-induced psychosis. As you know, Laura, my wife, Martha DeForti, runs such the first clinic, which has been going for about 3 years. And
Yes.
they have had very good, I mean, essentially what happens usually in the UK is patient comes into hospital, is away from cannabis, gets better, goes back out, starts using cannabis, and comes back psychotic again. The psychiatrist is annoyed and shouts at the patient, "What are you doing? You're off your head." Well, you wouldn't maybe not say that. Yeah, this is it's not worth me treating you if you're going to use cannabis. And shh, and says go away. So this is totally useless, of course.
Yeah.
So Martha has this clinic where they work with people using many of the same techniques as would be used by addiction services
Okay.
together. So you have to treat the addiction to cannabis and you have to treat the psychosis. And as you mentioned, they use this drug called Sativex because not many people realize how difficult it is to stop cannabis. You get nasty withdrawal symptoms. Sometimes when people who are psychotic come into hospital and they're forced to stop the cannabis, then they have the original psychosis, but they all have the withdrawal symptoms from the cannabis on top of that. So the Sativex has THC and CBD in it and can help to smooth the withdrawal. But in addition to that, we know that some antipsychotics are worse for people that have cannabis-induced psychosis or than others. People maybe know that the treatment for psychosis is to block dopamine, and the medications all block the transmitter dopamine. But if you're a drug addict, if you're dependent on a drug, you get reduced dopamine. That's why people keep craving, because the cocaine or the cannabis provides you with your dopamine, so your own body doesn't produce it. So you're always craving for more dopamine.
Mhm.
If you have that, and on top of that, we give you a very strong antipsychotic, we block the dopamine and make your craving worse. So there are drugs like haloperidol or risperidone, which I think make the craving worse and actually push people back towards wanting to take cannabis. Whereas
Mm.
there are other drugs which have a much more modest effect on on dopamine, maybe like quetiapine or olanzapine, where the dopamine blockade is not so heavy, and therefore the push to go towards more craving is not increased.
We've heard clozapine is successful
Yeah,
often for people with CIP.
yes,
That one's
but
another.
yes, but clozapine is officially supposed to be reserved for people who have failed to respond to 2 other
Several
antipsychotics.
others. Yes. Okay.
So
Thank you for that clarification. We have passed our time. May I have a few more moments to continue asking you questions, Robin?
yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. I know those of you who have to get off because you have other meetings, feel free. You will get the recording automatically, but we do have several more questions of Robin, and as long as he is kind enough to give him our time, we will continue. What is the drug class that marijuana belongs to? It's not a hallucinogen, is it? Or is it a psychogenic, psychodometic? I don't even know what that word is. How do you classify marijuana as a substance?
So that's a good question. It's no, it doesn't fall into a classic hallucinogen. We would just call it a psychotogenic drug, which is a drug which can induce a psychosis. So
Psychogenic. Okay.
the hallucinogens tend to work on a transmitter called serotonin. So things like LSD, they hit serotonin, whereas cannabis hits the amphetamine hits the dopamine system, cannabis hits our endocannabinoid system. And this is much more recently discovered, and there's still lots and lots we don't understand about the endocannabinoid system, but it probably moderates the dopamine and other transmitter systems. In fact, it's said, sometimes they say that the endocannabinoid system is like a hard hat. It's to protect your brain. Now, you would think, why would getting too much of a cannabinoid damage your brain when it's supposed to be protecting? But what I think happens is your endocannabinoid system produces moderate levels of these cannabinoids, and they have an interplay with other chemicals in the brain. But then you throw lots of cannabis at the system, which totally flattens the endogenous system.
Mm-hmm.
And then, for example, if one afternoon you don't get enough cannabis, then your own protective system, your own endocannabinoids are flattened and are not working. So in some ways, it's the sort of having lots of cannabinoids and then none that does the damage, rather than having a sort of steady level in the brain of your own endocannabinoids.
And is that the mechanism by which psychosis is actually caused by THC, is through the endocannabinoid system?
There's no doubt about that. Yes. So cannabis does not have a direct effect on something like dopamine, but it has an effect on the endocannabinoids, which in turn have an effect in what they call modulating the dopamine system. And one funny thing that has been discovered recently, particularly by a lady called Mizrahi, who is in Montreal, is that a proportion of people go psychotic not when they're taking cannabis, but when they stop.
And they stop.
And that is because the cannabis dysregulates the endocannabinoid system. Then you stop, then you get the withdrawal. And the withdrawal causes anxiety and agitation and insomnia. And of course, that facilitates you going psychotic.
I love your kitty. He's so cute.
Oh, yes. Looking at it.
Can you speak to the recovery time for CIP? How long do you think antipsychotic medication should be taken before attempting to stop using it, assuming the cannabis use has ceased?
How long is a piece of string? It's very difficult.
It depends. It all depends.
Yes. So if somebody has been smoking cannabis has been unlucky and been smoking cannabis for 3 months or 6 months and gone psychotic, then you would hope that after a few months of antipsychotic, that their brain would be able to normalize, and you might very gradually start decreasing. By gradually, I mean over many, many months. It's not that you can decrease the medication over 2 weeks. If you give any medication to your body readjusts. If you suddenly stop it, you get a rebound. So if you stop taking an antipsychotic suddenly, you'll get a rebound of the psychosis.
That's
So
what happened to Johnny. Stopped taking his Vraylar suddenly. We didn't know. Yeah.
yes, and of course that is the problem, that sometimes some psychiatrists say to you, "Oh, you've gone psychotic. You have to take an antipsychotic for life." And
Yeah.
people are horrified by this and say, "I'll show him," and throw the drugs out. So if somebody's just been taking cannabis for 3 or 6 months, maybe I would say after 6 months, you could very, very gently say, well, take a common drug would be something like quetiapine, and you might go from the dose might be 300 milligrams. You might go to 275 and see
Oh,
how they
wow.
go. for
Okay.
2 weeks, and if 2 weeks is okay, you might go to 250, and then you might go and very gradually. But if somebody has been smoking cannabis for 10 years, it's going to be much slower than that, and it may take many months or many years for them gradually to recover. So there have been studies where they have compared people who have developed psychosis for no apparent reason and followed them up. And then they've taken people who've gone psychotic following cannabis and showed that if they continue taking cannabis, they do worse than the people with sort of psychosis of unknown origin. They do the worst. If you take the people who use cannabis and stop, then very gradually they diverge in a better way from the people who just gone psychotic. So it maybe take 2 or 3 or 5 years. They're still slowly getting better.
Wow.
But,
So there's always hope. There's always hope the brain can
yeah,
continue to improve
and,
with continued sobriety, even years and years and years later.
and the other thing is that as you get older, your dopamine levels naturally decline. You
Mm-hmm.
know, at my age, you're more likely to get Parkinson's disease, which is a disease of lack of dopamine,
Wow.
than you are to go psychotic. Psychosis is a young person's disorder, and as you get
Oh,
older, dopamine levels naturally come down. So psychosis, there's every hope that as your dopamine levels come down, there is a tendency to natural improvement.
okay. Wow. Good stuff. Have studies proved that cannabis is the only factor in psychosis, or do psychosis patients have underlying mental health issues? We hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Psychosis,
So,
cannabis doesn't cause psychosis. They were already mentally ill and they were just self-medicating. They were going to get ill anyway.
yeah.
Is
So,
that
so
possible?
there's two questions there. One is, are there other factors? Yes. So there is that some people have more genetic vulnerability than others. Then people who have had a difficult birth, whose brains have been short of oxygen when they've been born, or people who've been abused as a child, or people who have, interestingly, people who have migrated from one country to another, or people who have been bullied or had a lot of nasty things happen. So all of these factors can increase your risk of psychosis. So we call these component causes. So they're one cause. So quite often somebody will maybe have some people who are cannabis develop cannabis psychosis. They quite often say, "Well, how can it be the cannabis? All my buddies smoke just as much as me," but they may be more genetically vulnerable. The
Mm-hmm.
other so the question is, are people uh, ill before? No, that's been definitely disproved. The vast majority of people, they start their cannabis use when they seem entirely healthy and just like actually more cannabis users tend to be more sociable and actually competent than most of us, because for it to be a 15-year-old and start using cannabis, one, you've got to have buddies that, well, where it's illegal, you have got to have buddies who will introduce you to a dealer, and you've got to be clever enough to get the money and conceal it from your teachers and your parents. So they're often very smart and sociable people who run into problems.
Hmm.
It is the case, though, we can now measure your genetic vulnerability to psychosis by things like 23andMe. You can send off your DNA, and we can do that also for psychosis. And it is the case that if you have more of a predisposition, it's easier to push you into psychosis. So it's like if you have a family history of heart disease, you're more likely to develop a heart disease. I mean, you can develop heart disease from obesity and smoking cigarettes and taking no exercise, but if you have a family history, then these things have a bigger push. And that's the same with cannabis, that some people are are more susceptible to it. But it's certainly not the case that that people who develop cannabis-induced psychosis were going to develop it anyway. Was
Do you have a guess at what a percentage would be that you see in your work of people who otherwise you believe would not have become psychotic had they not used marijuana or cannabis? In fact, it pushed them into psychosis when otherwise they would have been fine. Do you have an estimate?
Of the people who are taking cannabis, 80% would have been okay, I think.
80% would have been okay. Wow.
Yeah.
That's huge.
But I mean, it's a bit it's a bit like something like alcohol. Why do people become alcoholic? Most people become alcoholic because they like alcohol and they enjoy drinking and they enjoy the sociability of going out and with their buddies and so on. But there is a small proportion who find that alcohol, maybe people in their 30s and 40s and more, find that alcohol can help them when they're depressed or anxious. And I think it's a bit like with cannabis. Most of our patients, they nearly all start, actually mostly start because they enjoy it, because a friend has introduced it, or increasingly because somebody in the family has introduced it to them. But about 14% of our patients say they started it because they felt it did something for them, and it seemed to diminish their anxiety or make them feel better. So there is that small proportion.
That's just 14% though.
Yeah.
Wow, I had no idea it was that high. Thank you for that. Where is the knowledge of CIP among physicians? There's a sense that psychosis is very transient. They just say, oh, it's a few days, a few weeks. Are there studies anywhere showing kind of the length of first psychosis or numbers that go on to have permanent schizophrenia with or without, continued use? How do we know?
With continued use, there's no doubt that the outlook is very bad. That the people who continue to use, they just recycle through the hospitals, getting better, going out, meeting their dealer. Well, of course, I say a dealer, but I guess it's like when you walk down the road and you pass the dispensary and you smell it, then you have to be very determined not to go in and say, oh well, I'll just have one joint. I can't say about how much knowledge the average physician has in the United States about cannabis-induced psychosis. I would put it close to zero. From
yeah, they seem to think it's harmless.
In England, in the UK, it's pretty widespread. There was I'll give you an example. There was a cartoon in the Times of saying what was the origins of Brexit. Why did our politicians all vote for Brexit? And they had the cabinet, the Conservative government, all sitting around smoking joints. And the implication was that joints make you mad, which makes you vote for Brexit.
I got it.
So, I mean, I'm not saying that to do with Brexit. It just shows that the cartoonist for the Times knew that his audience knew that cannabis can induce psychosis.
So they were all losing their minds, clearly.
Yeah, it may be true, of course.
Maybe that's partly true. So the shift to legalization is increasing, yes, as you know. Should we just accept that legalization is going to happen and then mitigate against the impact by education, as we have done with cigarette smoking, and just start it very young? What are you all doing to educate? That's something that we keep banging our heads against the wall on, that as we get more legalization, the narrative is that, oh, well, it's legal, it's harmless, and our kids, kind of grow up with that? Should we stop trying to make legalization not happen and just go with the whole education and prevention approach?
I can't say what you should do, but what we do is say, let's wait a bit longer and see what happens in the States. I have the I have the
Keeping
impression
us as
that,
the guinea pigs?
see, until about 5 years ago, there was hardly any discussion. Even Nora Wolkoff, the head of the National Institute for Drug Abuse, when I talked to her 10 years ago, she didn't think marijuana was a problem. Or she
Right.
might have thought it was a problem in terms of dependence, but she'd never heard of cannabis-induced psychosis. I
Psychosis.
remember talking with her about it, but now she's writing blogs saying it's quite a big issue. And I think psychiatrists in the US were very well. I say psychiatrists, emergency physicians,
Doctors.
addiction peoples were very slow to wake up. Well, of course, not only have you had the calamities of COVID and so on, but you've also had the opioid calamity, which we haven't had, and so you've had other distractions. But I think the evidence is piling up, and it will gradually pile up. And I guess my hope is that by the time the UK is beginning to seriously consider legalization, that the evidence will be so strong that whatever they do, they'll not open the floodgates to commercialization as they have in some US states.
And continue to lock it down, regulate it, limit the potency. The only hope I guess we have is that they take it over federally and that the FDA, I don't think the marijuana industry wants the FDA coming in and regulating things.
Yes,
And
I
having
have
limits.
another hope, and that is that Elon Musk, who is an advocate for cannabis, that he goes psychotic, and
Maybe he is already. I don't know.
and we get huge amounts of publicity on
Yeah.
the back of this.
Well, and that's tongue in cheek, I know, but it's so true that many times legislators are for marijuana until they have a relative, a child, a nephew, a niece who goes psychotic. And then all of a sudden, they are the biggest proponents for anti-legalization. Unfortunately, that it has to happen with
Yeah,
someone close to them before they figure that
yeah,
out.
yeah.
Do you have a curriculum for cannabis education in youth in the UK? We have some here, but is there an evidence that it's evidence-based being used currently that you know of?
No,
Okay.
not well. It would be sort of sporadic.
Yeah.
Laura, I'm going to have to go. You can see the sun
Yeah.
is
The
the sun
sun
is
is in your,
getting low in the UK just now. It's
and now
shining.
you're trying to block the sunshine. Well, thank you so much for your time, for your friendship, for your expertise, for your willingness to contribute and stay on an extra 23 minutes past our ending
Well,
time. We're
it's
so
very
grateful.
interesting to me to understand the situation in the US, and
Well, you're getting a lot of thank yous, thank yous. This is fantastic. Thank you. Really appreciate you so much, Robin.
thanks, Laura. Bye bye. Bye,
Much love.
everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.